Hi, everyone. So, yeah, my name's Euan, Adie. I'm from Altmetric. So we're also quite a small commercial company. We're also a startup. We're based over in London. I suppose what makes us a little bit different from some of the other people in the space is that we're not so focused on the researcher as the end user, I suppose. We're much more focused on publishing companies. The services we offer are more like author services. Oh, sorry, you couldn't hear me. I won't repeat that, but the services we offer are much more focused on the author or the editor and publisher than kind of looking at someone's entire body of work. So to give an example, Impact Story can track things like code repositories and slides on SlideShare and this kind of thing, all these kind of non-traditional metrics, non-traditional outputs rather. We're much more focused on actually traditional outputs, non-traditional metrics for traditional outputs. I won't go into a lot of detail about the products. We do have a booth, so we are the digital science booth in the exhibition hall. If you want to come past and get a demo there, that's probably the best way of doing it. As a slight correction to what Julie said, we're not actually owned by Macmillan. Macmillan invested in us, but we're a separate company. Just thought I should clarify that. So, yeah, so I said I didn't want to speak about the product. What I did want to speak to is about two of the sort of newer sources that we work on, just because I think it's interesting to talk about how Altmetrics isn't necessarily the same thing now as it was 6 months ago or a year ago. It's a very new field. It's a very fast-moving field. And specifically, the two I'm going to talk about are mainstream media mentions and mentions in policy documents, government policy documents. So I think all of our tools certainly have been focused a lot on the kind of social media side of things, you know, how many people are sharing something on Twitter or blogging about something, this kind of thing. And that's a very useful indicator of some types of impact. But there's obviously lots of different indicators of impact, and they all mean different things to different people. Some are more useful to some groups of people than others. So with mainstream media, for example, it's much more about, well, it depends on the media source, but you could say, for example, it's much more interesting for measuring public engagement. If your article gets picked up by the New York Times, that's going to reach a mainstream audience beyond what beyond the people that read the journal, for example, or at least most of the time, depending on the journal. And there's some unique challenges involved in tracking this information. So we're lucky enough with a lot of the online activity that when people are talking about papers, generally they link to the paper. And that is quite good. I mean, if you think about something like a trade book, if someone tweets about a book they've read, they don't necessarily link to the Amazon page. So in that respect, scholarly publishing is lucky, and that, you know, especially in STM publishing, you know, we're all used to using the identifiers like the DOI, and, you know, there's clear places to link to, and canonical versions of work and things like that. Even if we do have to do this kind of disambiguation that Andrea mentioned. So the problem with newspapers and magazines is, and it's a problem that of our own creation, of our industry's creation, is that newspapers don't link to articles when they talk about them. So you can't rely on that article in the New York Times actually having a link to the paper in Cell or wherever it is. So we have to do a little bit more legwork and look for things like, well, the way we do it, for example, is we look for a journal name and then an author name. And because there's canonical metadata in databases like Crossref, we're able to go off and like cross-reference that and say, okay, well, it turns out that there was a paper published a week ago by that author in this journal, so it's probably a good match, and all we need to do is kind of confirm it by looking at sort of shared terms of unusual frequency and things like that. And the kinds of things that get mentioned in the news and picked up in the news aren't the same as are popular on social media. So in general, of course, Altmetrics doesn't measure quality in the same way that citations don't measure quality. Things are popular for all sorts of reasons. So it could be, well, certainly if you look in across the entire publishing industry and you look at the papers that do very well in Altmetrics, some are, you know, papers with key advances and are proper, you know, scientific breakthroughs and things like that. And there's also a lot that, you know, basically if you mention weight loss, sex, cannabis, there's some topics that you can tell immediately are going to get like tweeted, not necessarily by the people who you want to be your audience. It is still getting attention, just not necessarily the ones you want it to get it from. Media obviously has a kind of layer of curation in that the journalist, even if it's just going through some press releases and picking out which ones look interesting to them, they're curating it somewhat. And then ideally, in most cases, they're taking the press release and they're adding some value to it by explaining it to a broader audience. And the next one is policy documents. So I find this is a particularly interesting thing for us. And it's a bit strange in a way that, on the one hand, it's a great Altmetric in that it's a clear indicator of impact that's not picked up by citations, right? If the World Health Organization has a committee and they read one of your papers and they say, oh, okay, actually that's a good idea, we should use it in the next, recommendation for treating malaria that's coming out next May or whatever, then that's impact. You've directly affected something that's going to happen in the real world that's not going to be picked up by your traditional citations. On the other hand, one of the things that's good about Altmetrics is that they're very fast to collect. You could say, at least in the life sciences, it might take a year and a half before you've got a decent number of citations before you can tell, is this paper going to be cited a lot or not? But when you look at something like Twitter, certainly what we see is within about 3 days after publication, it's got a paper has, in general, got about 50% of the tweets it's ever going to get that year. So that's completely not the case, and the timescale is even longer than citations. So it can take 5 or 6 years before a paper that's been published starts appearing in policy documents or guidelines. So it's a bit of a trade-off. I mean, Altmetrics is all about getting all these very different metrics and just making it easy to collect them and interpret them. So it's worth bearing or having an open mind as to what that means exactly. And the kind of Altmetrics, again, that you can get out of it is different to the social media. So I mentioned that what we do is very much an author service, and that's because authors, they want to hear about what people are saying about their work. They don't necessarily want to wait 2 years to see if the community's responded favorably to it. So if you're able to show people, these are the people that are blogging about it, and it's been picked up in these different news sources and this kind of thing, then they like that. Policy documents, of course, authors do go back and check citations. Do you still go back over your papers 6 years later to see if they've been picked up? It's a bit more, a bit less likely, I suppose. But that's not to mean that the metrics we can get out of it aren't useful. So particularly on the journal level, if we can aggregate upwards, and we can start answering questions like, if we look at health policy in the UK, so this body, NICE in the UK, is the Centre for Clinical Excellence, and it produces guidelines for doctors in the NHS. We can say, okay, of all the documents that they produce relating to diabetes, if we look at the references in those documents, what percentage come from different medical journals? And that's useful there to get an idea of how useful all of the research in your journal is. It's not necessarily the author level anymore, it's much more the publisher or editorial level. And sometimes it's not surprising. So actually, if you do that, it turns out that the Lancet and BMJ or JAMA are the 3 big journals that, in this case, have the most references. But actually, there's some smaller journals as well that do pretty well. So I actually can't remember what CRMO stands for now, but certainly clinical therapeutics. They're good journals, but they're not, sort of impact factor 30 journals. It's more like 2.5, something like that. But actually, they punch way above their weight in this particular area. So that's certainly useful information to have if you run that journal. Maybe it's an area you can focus on. And yeah, I'll leave it there. So.